Hey guys, it's Joey. Welcome back to Celtic Calling, and this week we are focusing on Rhiannon, who is a Welsh horse goddess. Her name means White Witch or Great Queen. She's an inspiring figure for poets, artists and singers. She possesses a deep magic. She is a witch and a healer, as well as being a goddess. And I enjoyed this reference from, I think it was Rhiannon.ie.myth. A princess submerged in cultural darkness who lies in the shadows of our dreams, waiting to come to life with vigour and passion once again. I thought that was lovely, and how accurate that can often be of many of the Celtic pantheon, who, as we have discussed in previous weeks, often become sort of watered down or through their myths. So Morrigan becomes Morgan Le Fay, and you know, some argue that Bran sort of becomes a sorcerer, the Fisher King, rather than his godhood. And last week we talked about Arwen becoming a fae. So that's true of Rhiannon as well. A goddess of birds and horses is also known as Queen of the Fairies. And it's interesting how a lot of these are given the title Queen of the Fairies, as if these myths sort of either conflict with one another, or they all sort of hold a similar thread. And I will be drinking water in this video, I apologise. I have a sore throat. So that, I think, is an interesting little tidbit to sort of think about, how all the Celtic gods quite often interplay with similar mythos, especially when the mythos starts becoming watered down. So they become Queen of the Fae. If they have any sexualised aspect, they often become Fae, so they're dangerous, like we discussed last week. She's a sovereignty goddess who the king must wed to legitimise his rule. A goddess of transformation, she uses her powers for love of others or self. She appears in the first and third branches of the Welsh story Mabinogion, a narrative which grew out of the ancient myths of the Celtic gods. Sacred to her is the moon, horses, horseshoes, gates, songbirds, the wind and the number 7. In the Mabinogion, Rhiannon first appears to Powell, king of the new tribes of Dyfed, as a beautiful dream vision, riding a glowing white horse, her hair shining in the sun, birds twittering around her head. That's an interesting idea, isn't it? Come to me, twitty twit. Love it. She seemed to be bathed in a golden light. Thus begins her journey to attain the man she desires. Her father had promised her to another who she didn't want to marry. She wanted to marry Powell, and sort of takes things into her own hands. No matter how fast Powell chases her, she remains elusive, appearing not to notice him and aloof. It's a good game. Finally, he asks her to stop, and she complies, saying, "Since you ask it of me, I will gladly stop." She then confesses her love to Powell and tells him that her father wants her to marry another. Not only is Powell smitten, but his legitimacy as king is in question, and he must marry Rhiannon as sort of a test to prove his legitimacy of sovereignty. He follows her to the fairy realm, where she promises to marry him, and here he is tricked by Powell, Rhiannon's suitor, into giving her to him. It's a custom of gift giving, and he gets tricked. Rhiannon advised Powell to ask Powell for a year respite, so she didn't have to sleep with him for a year, and in the meantime tricks him into a bottomless sack, so only he only strange noises in my house. Apparently my house didn't like the idea of the bottomless sack. So he can escape only if he gives up Rhiannon. So it's sort of game-playing, underhanded trickstery type thing. In this part of the story we see Rhiannon in her aspect as a fertility goddess of love and as a dream goddess, but she's also an otherworld and death goddess. So let's go over that mythology a little bit because there's some interesting points. There is the idea of her being connected to the sovereignty of the land, which is a common Celtic myth and is tied to the Morrigan in my experiences as well. Quite frequently as well, you find that goddesses who are connected with the land and horses have this kind of running wild and free element within them. Macha has it when she runs a race because her mortal husband bet that she could outrun the horses, and gives birth to the twins on the finish line. And here Rhiannon keeps running until sort of Powell verbally asks her grace. He sort of asks her favour, if you like, and she loves him, and it's like a test, you know, will he not submit but put her on an equal pegging field, which is always fantastic in Celtic myth, that, you know, the women have, and goddesses and female archetypes have this strong sense of worth, of wildness about them, and you know, kings had to prove themselves. And then there's the legitimacy of the king being tied to a goddess who is to do with fertility, love, and obviously the land. And we've discussed in length before about the Celts believing that the land would only prosper if the king was a good king, a youthful king, and looked after the land and paid homage to the goddesses and gods. She takes him to a different world to marry him, the realm of the Fae, the other world in some descriptions, and so there's sort of a parallel there. It's like, was it originally the realm of the Fae, or did she take him to the other world, like the realm of the gods, the afterlife between life and death, and that becomes the realm of the Fae within the myths changing over time. And if it was the other world between life and death, that ties in a little bit more to the idea of her having a death aspect, and indeed of her being a dream goddess and being able to sort of freely move between these realms, sort of tying into the idea of our subconscious being able to touch the other worlds, the other realms. Okay. Years pass in the land of Dyfed, and Rhiannon finally births a son. But she and her ladies fell into a deep sleep, and her son was stolen. When the ladies awoke, they discovered the baby was gone and feared for their lives. To escape responsibility, this is horrendous, they smeared puppy blood on Rhiannon. With blood on her and puppy bones all around her, they accused her of murdering her son. It gets better. There are theories that in a more ancient or primal aspect as a death goddess, the story goes that she actually did murder her son, as to sort of highlight the story of the goddess gives and the goddess takes away, and like gives birth and can also take life, and that being a balance within this sort of very dark story. And it's noted here that if that was the original story, it would be drawing parallels to the Germanic goddess Mora, the nightmare horse-shaped goddess of terror. And obviously you have the horse crossover there, and nightmare being the balance to the dream aspect. So you can't have dreams without nightmares. Now, this is quite, from all my research anyway, this is hypothetical. and it's just possible, and that's become lessened over time because the idea of infanticide is so horrendous, and obviously it's going to be horrendous to us today. Her mother killing her child is one of the most horrendous crimes against nature as far as a lot of people are concerned. And certainly to the onset of Christianity coming through, a huge sin, and apart from anything, it sort of took away from their ideal of what a mother should be, this sort of obedient, loving, kind, all for her children and not for herself. And that then becomes that the crime didn't happen. Now, whether or not that myth was originally that much darker, much more brutal reflection of brutal times is up in the air. It's questionable, and I haven't worked with the goddess herself, so it's difficult to know, but the idea of her having a nightmare aspect as well as a dream aspect I can fully get behind. So continuing with a myth where it didn't happen, it was the trickery of ladies. The punishment for the crime that didn't happen, Rhiannon was forced to become like a horse herself, sentenced to stand on a block at the castle gate for 7 years. When visitors arrived, she had to confess her crimes and offer to carry them on her back, though few accepted because of her beauty and humility. Ultimately, after 2 winters, her son and her place were restored to her. When her son was first returned to her, she exclaimed that her praedere, I think that's, did I have a praedere? Praedere? I think it might be praedere. Her grief anxiety was finally ended, and thus he received his name from his mother, as was Welsh custom. She was returned to Powell's side as queen. And then the story continues after his death. So 7 years she was sentenced to. It sounds like she only carried out 2. And because she didn't know whether or not she had murdered her son in this element, her grief and her despair was that she accepted this punishment of carrying people on her back. And we will come back to that in a minute. After Powell's death, Rhiannon married Manawydan, son of Lear, but a spell fell on the land of Dyfed and it became barren. Rhiannon, Manawydan, her son and his wife were the only living souls left, so they set out for new lands looking for fresh supplies. In Arbeth, they returned to Arbeth after they had been roaming for fresh supplies and things, and they followed a white boar into a deserted fortress where both Rhiannon and her son were disappeared. Supposedly he touched a golden cup and vanished, and she went looking for him. It was under a spell. Fortunately, Manawydan finally broke the spell on Dyfed, cast by Lywt to avenge Gawal, Rhiannon's suitor who had been tricked. Rhiannon and her son had served as servants in Lywt's court during their absence. Rhiannon with a halter as seen on asses, like a donkey, around her neck, going back to the horse connection. The grace and dignity with which Rhiannon suffers her trials, unjust punishments, and the halter all reinforce her endurance as a horse goddess, and she promotes lessons of patience, that the pains and injustices we suffer will be brought into alignment with the natural state of balance in the universe. Truth and justice will finally prevail. Rhiannon reminds us of our own sovereign wholeness, enabling us to cast out the role of victim from our lives forever. In her guise as death goddess, Rhiannon could sweetly sing enough to lure all those hearing her to their death. There isn't an awful lot of information about her role as a death goddess. There's that about her singing voice, and that ties back to the power of the word, the power of the voice that we've discussed in other videos. In other videos we've discussed how Bave's screech foreshadowed death, Nivun's screech caused death, and here Rhiannon could sing people to death, literally. You know, her sweet lullabies would lure people to their death. Again, that sort of siren aspect, which is possibly where the myth sort of watered down to. And in all of her stories, she suffers everything with this complete grace and endurance, and she doesn't go on any, from what I can tell, there's no wrath involved, which you can find in the other stories. You can find in Morrigan's stories. You can find, you know, she seems to have a softer, more enduring side. She goes through her trials, she goes through her battles, and sort of not suffers them willingly, but suffers them with sort of a grace and a strength that is beautiful when you read about the stories. And she quite regularly suffers at the hands of men. First and foremost, her father is determined she's going to marry Gwal, and she's having none of it. It draws on all her tricks and cunning and goes for what she wants, asserts her independence, has that air of sovereignty about her, refuses what she does not want to do, and instead embraces a path in which she marries the man she wants to marry. She ends up being punished by the man she doesn't want to marry, the man she does want to marry, first and foremost, Powell, for a crime that she didn't commit, but that's at the hands of women in this story. It's interesting to sort of think about whether or not she would have been so full of humility had she actually committed the crime, because that doesn't kind of balance with the later story. Again, it's difficult. But in her realm of being a goddess of dream, it does sort of bring up the ideas of the psyche, like the darker parts of our psyche, of our subconscious, of our ability to be dark, well, not dark, I hate the term dark because it doesn't fit, but our ability to do great and terrible deeds, if you like. Harry! Terrible, yes, but great. Harry Potter references for the win. Oh dear. We were doing so well in this video. It touches on our abilities to be able to do terrible things, and the realm of dreams is often sort of, it touches on parts of ourselves and makes us deal with parts of ourselves that maybe we are less pleasant, or we don't want to deal with them quite so much, and shadow work and things of that nature. So for working with our dreams and our subconscious, Rhiannon would have that amazing energy. We've touched on overcoming trials and embracing them with grace and not allowing ourselves to be in victim mode, which is something I believe in incredibly strongly, and I have talked to the Morrigan at length about this, because this is something which I have never ever liked. I don't like the whole idea of poor me, why do things always happen to me? And taking that and then blaming other people for it. You know, it's not my fault, it's not anything I've done, rather than facing your trials and overcoming them. And I saw this a lot growing up. I've seen it a lot since being grown up, for whatever that means. And I just can't bear it. And I think there's something in the Celtic pantheon about that feeling. Like, that's one of the big reasons why I have been drawn to the Celtic pantheon, because that's here, you know, the idea of allowing yourself to place the blame elsewhere, of, oh, well, I've got to deal with this and this and this, so poor me, and I can behave, it's just not acceptable within the Celtic pantheon. And here is another example of a goddess showing that the strength and dignity and grace required to come through trials, even if they are in unjust trials, to show her endurance, to show that strength of will to keep going. And the totem of the horse, of course, being all tied in with this. is perfect because, you know, wild horses on the one hand, of that wild roaming free energy, and then them working alongside man for most of history, of being a close friend, more than just an animal of burden, even to non pagans who, you know, connect deeply with animals and animal welfare, even to humanity en masse. The sort of horse has that standing. Truth, justice. We've talked about the role of the Fae. And, well, I suppose we'll touch on the fact that truth comes out in all these situations. You know, even when she has suffered injustice, in the end, it all comes out. I'd like to know if those women got their just desserts for lying about her. I keep looking, I can't find it at the minute. I will keep looking all week. Now, I would have liked to have heard more about her role as a death goddess. You know, heard about her lulling people to sleep, and this fantastic idea that she might have parallels to the Germanic Mora, because I really do believe that the goddesses do have their balancing sides, you know, dreams and nightmares being in this case. And obviously, if the death of her son, if that did occur, that would show a role as a death goddess. And obviously travelling to the other world, as we earlier discussed, are 3 points where the other world and sort of the role of life, death and birth come into play. Obviously she loses her husband and carries on, which is often an unusual state of affairs. It's sort of to remarry like that is not often, but it feels unusual within the realm of mythology. Quite frequently within a lot of mythology, maybe more outside of the Celtic mythology, but in mythology in general, quite frequently, you know, when a husband dies, that's kind of it. You know, he was my great love and that was it. Whereas here, clearly, Powell was her great love, but she remarried. Which is interesting. And she has her own power. You know, there's a definite feminine strength to her. She overcomes all these trials. She remarries. She marries initially for love, not for being told who she should marry. And there's a huge energy of strength. And again, that very horsey, punchy strength energy coming through, you know. The will to endure, the will to travel their own path. That's seeing life as a journey. So I thoroughly enjoyed the research on this one. I thought it was really interesting, and some of the myths, and you can touch on whether or not they're a little bit darker than they first appear, and that sort of thing is really interesting to me. So that was Celtic Calling for this week for the goddess Rhiannon. I hope you enjoyed, and many blessings.